Recently in a sermon about being guided by the Holy Spirit, I talked about how many of us today would really be or think we would be good Jews because we like to live by checklists and rules and do's and don'ts and things of that nature. And instead, we're called by God as Christians to be led by the Spirit of God that lives inside of us. And that gives us freedom, but the problem is sometimes too much freedom can feel pretty difficult. And so we live a life where we're looking for God's permission instead of seeking God's presence. We look for God's permission instead of seeking God's presence. And we can apply the same thing to many different facets of our life. How can I seek God's permission in my relationships? How can I seek God's permission in my personal life? And how can I seek God's permission in my finances? So I got a question for this series about how to handle our finances and is it wrong to save for retirement and enjoy retirement? I think the first question that I thought to myself is, are we asking the wrong question here? Because this sounds like a permission-giving question and not necessarily a question that's about seeking God's guidance and presence. So it makes sense we would apply this same permission-giving idea, though, to the way that we handle our finances, because our money is black and white, right? We get paid a certain amount, and Uncle Sam takes his cut, and the grocery store takes their cut, and the gas station takes their larger cut than it should be. And so everything has its place. We can organize it in a spreadsheet. It makes perfect sense to us whether we have enough or we don't have quite enough. Finances seem black and white. So when we compare that to our faith and think about how our finances operate in our faith, we often can think, well, how is this black and white in my faith too? Then how much am I supposed to give and how much am I supposed to save? But we start asking black and white questions because we think money is black and white, but the truth is money isn't black and white at all. When you think about wealth is gray. Because think about it this way. You might see passages in Scripture where Jesus talks about money, and he says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter God's kingdom. We think, well, I'm not rich, so that passage isn't about me, and we move on with our lives. But when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, I've been to some places in this world, and I know you're aware of some places in this world that if you're within the scope of hearing my voice, you're wealthy beyond imagination. So what do you do with that? In our context, you might not be wealthy compared to your neighbor, but compared to somebody else, you might seem extremely wealthy. We hear more teachings from Jesus about how all money is God's, and so how we steward it matters. And so we think, well, I'm gonna not spend so much money on frivolous things, and I'm not gonna spend so much money on clothes, but that doesn't avoid us away from a moral issue. Because what if by saving money on clothes, we started putting our money toward a place and toward an organization that's really causing significant harm to the world through, sweatshops run by kids across the globe or some other sort of damage that's happening to our world? See, it gets muddy really fast. And then when we consider what Jesus is telling us and what Jesus teaches about money, there's no 401ks, there's no Roth IRAs. All this stuff was not happening at the time of Jesus, and so he's not teaching on those things. And so when we talk about savings and how much money we should put away, and is it okay to put money away, and is it okay to enjoy retirement, we're asking black and white questions when Jesus gives us something that's not quite so black and white. And I think one of the reasons that we like to ask black and white questions, not just about money, but about lots of other things, is this right? Is this a sin? Is this bad? Is this okay? Is because we would rather be told yes or no than we would be told than we would like to be told. How is that thing affecting your heart? How is that thing changing the way that you love others? How is that thing changing the way that you sacrifice for others? How is that thing transforming the way that you live and live your life in a way that looks like Jesus? But these are the questions that Jesus asked when it came to many different things, and it's the same thing he asked when it came to money. Because think about what Jesus talked about when he talked about money. He talked about money a lot We don't like to think that he did, but Jesus talked about money a lot because he was aware of the fact that money has the power to transform for good or transform for bad, and so he taught on it. But we think about passages, or we think about things in terms of percentages, and we say 10% tithe is kind of the standard, and that's what we go for. But the truth of the matter is, that's not as black and white either when it all comes down to it. So what Jesus says is not 10% across the board. Let me tell you what I mean. We know the story of the poor widow who put 2 pennies in the offering plate, and Jesus says this woman has given more than even the most extravagant giver here. We see Jesus praise Zacchaeus when Zacchaeus gives 50% of what he has to those in need. And we see Jesus go further still and tell a rich man to sell all of his possessions and give them to the poor. He says, if you want to follow me, sell all of your possessions and give them to the poor. You see any prescriptions in there? No, it's much more gray than we seem to think. And the reason that it's more gray is because Jesus is less concerned about what we do with our money as he is with what our money does to us. Did you catch that? Jesus is far more concerned about what our money does to us than what we do with our money. Because money has the ability to transform and change our hearts in positive and negative ways. So it's more about, what is your money doing to you? Not what are you doing with your money? I used this text recently in the sermon. It comes from Luke 12. And what happens in this story is that Jesus is asked by somebody else to tell his brother to give him his portion of the inheritance. And Jesus tells a story about a guy who had such surplus of crop that he took his extra crop and he built an additional barn to store his crop in. So he's already got one full barn. He has to build another barn to store his crop in. But then Jesus says the problem is this guy stores up all this crop, but he dies the very same night that he stores it all up. And Jesus says these words, "This is how it will be with those who store things up for themselves, but are not rich toward God." This is how it will be for those who store things up for themselves, but are not rich toward God. See, in this passage, Jesus doesn't make saving money and giving to God as if they are impossible to happen at the same time. Jesus says nothing about the man having a barn already. Jesus says, your money has corrupted you. Your abundance has corrupted you to the point where you don't have any spirit of generosity within you. You no longer give to God at all out of any of this. So what Jesus is pointing at here is, where's your heart at in this? When you have this abundance and you have this overflow, your heart is to store it all up for yourself, not to share any of it with anybody. Because when we talk about savings, we can put this passage back on its head and take the example of Jesus for Jesus to say, well, if you don't know what's going to happen with your life and you could die, so you shouldn't store up all this stuff and not be generous toward God, then you can take the same approach and say, well, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow if you get injured and you can't work anymore and you can't make yourself any money, and so it's good for you to be saving up some of this money. See, Jesus takes no issue with the saving. Jesus takes the issue with what's happening in this man's heart, that he has nothing to give away to his neighbor, to God, because he stores all of it up for himself. Money has done something to this man's heart that Jesus takes exception to. So he has to grow in his generosity to give some of it to God and stop being corrupted by the money that he has and the abundance that he has. So in the midst of all this, when we're saving and when we're earning and when we're giving, Jesus says that you can still bring an offering to God that is entirely unfit. So you can follow the rules all you want, Jesus says. The rule of the day was 10%. And so Jesus tells the Pharisees one time, he says, woe to the Pharisees, you give 1/10 of everything that you have, but you skip out on ministries of righteousness and ministries of justice and ministries for providing to your neighbor. You need to do the former without neglecting the latter, Jesus says. So Jesus says if your life is not an offering to God, then whatever offering that you would give financially is pointless. It has to be an outpouring of wanting to give back to God out of the things that God has given us. Our entire lives are sacrifices. Because God has given us the greatest sacrifice. We respond in kind. So what this means when it comes to saving our money is this. If our whole lives are sacrifices to God, then what we do with our money is going to reflect that. When we spend it, it's going to reflect that. When we earn it, it's going to reflect that. And when we save it, it's going to reflect that. When we give it, when we earn it, and when we save it, it's going to be a reflection of our hearts. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So what exactly are we doing with it? When we're storing up money for ourselves, which I can agree is a good thing to do, to save money is a good thing to do, how is that money going to be a resource for you in ministry? How is that money going to help you sacrifice that others might gain? Maybe for you it's, well, in retirement I'll be able to have free time where I'm not working from 9 to 5 or even longer shifts than that, and I devote all of my time and energy and resources to what I do at work. When I save up this money now, I can give of my time and I can give of my finances, and I'm taken care of all at the same time, but now I'm in this new phase of life and ministry and serving Jesus because of how I took care of myself financially now. But Jesus would say, do that. That sounds great. But in your time of saving and your time of preparation, don't forsake giving to God, and don't forsake ministries of justice and ministries of righteousness that do good for God and do good for neighbor as well. So whatever you do with your money, is it a God-honoring way of handling it? Jesus wants to look into your heart. You need to ask yourself the piercing question of, what does the way that I handle my money reveal about my heart, and is that a God-honoring thing? That is not a black and white question. And it means that on all of this, we're all going to be on different scales. We all make different amounts of money. We're all on different parts of our journeys of life, to where we're younger or when we're older. And so the money means different things to us, and our needs change as well. So we have to consider all of this when we're asking ourselves questions like these. But ultimately, are you so moved and so convicted by the sacrifice that Jesus has given to you that you live in sacrifice so that others might be loved in the same way that you love? And sacrifice ultimately is costly. And I mean that financially, but I mean it beyond financially, that it's not sacrifice if we don't really feel it. It's not sacrifice if it doesn't make us change the way that we live in order to give to others, whether it's our time, our treasure, or our talent. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross was costly. And so our sacrifice, so that others might know that same love of Jesus, should be costly as well. The founder of Methodism, John Wesley, offered this advice when it came to stewardship and handling our money. He said, earn as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can. Those were his 3 rules. Earn as much as you can, save as much as you can, and give as much as you can. Because our focus shouldn't be on receiving permission for how much or when or any of this kind of stuff. It shouldn't be focused on percentages. It shouldn't be focused on zeros. It shouldn't be focused on amounts. It should be focused on progress. Are we progressing toward a place where our heart is continually being moved and continually being transformed by the Spirit of God, that we live differently, that we look more like Jesus, that every little bit and nook and cranny and corner of our existence is all about loving Jesus and making Jesus known by loving others? That's where we need to be looking to seek answers to this question, and not about, is this wrong or is that wrong or how much? But is God moving me toward a place where I'm loving God and loving others, and using the financial resources that I have as means